I'm going to speak on science and Christianity today. Let me just begin by reading you a statement that was made by the late William Provine, who was a professor of biology at the Ivy League's Cornell University. And here's what Provine said, quote, "Let me summarize my views on what modern evolutionary biology tells us loud and clear." It should have been loudly and clearly. There are no gods. There are no purposes in life. No goal-directed forces of any kind. In other words, nothing happens for the sake of a reason. There's no life after death. When I die, I am absolutely certain that I'm going to be dead. That's the end for me. There's no ultimate foundation for ethics, no ultimate meaning to life, and no free will for humans either. And so this is increasingly becoming the attitude of folk who are enamored with science to the exclusion of having knowledge of other fields. They very, very often scientists speak to the public through media and so on, and they speak on topics for which they don't have the proper training. And that's what makes them dangerous, because they don't know how ignorant they are in these areas. Now, they may be really good at frogs. You know, Richard Dawkins is a zoologist, I think. I don't know, does he study frogs? I don't know. He ought to stick with frogs. When he starts asking who designed the designer, things don't go well for him. So what we have is a situation where science is seen as undermining Christianity. And Time magazine not long ago had a cover story on how the universe would end. And it acknowledged that the universe was going to end, largely because of the second law of thermodynamics, which means the universe is using up its useful energy, and someday all the heat and light and motion in the universe is going to go out, and the universe will die a dark death. And at the beginning of the article it says that human beings have wanted to know the answer as to how all this is going to end for millennia. But unfortunately, the only place they could look to for answers was religion and philosophy, which amount to idle speculation. Now, for the first time, we've been able to turn to science with these questions, and accordingly, for the first time in human history, we have finally obtained answers to those questions. And so the idea is that philosophy and theology and other fields are not capable of answering questions about reality, but science can. And so when science moves into an area, it provides answers and solutions to things that other fields who've had a vested interest in that really don't have anything to say about it. I think if you were here, Bill last night asked the question that he had been told, rightly so, that one of the central intellectual issues about our day is theological anthropology, or just anthropology in general. What is a human person? And if that question is left to neuroscience, it's going to turn out that you're largely a brain and a central nervous system, maybe a body, and that's kind of the last story about you. Well, then it becomes very difficult, if not impossible, to sustain life after death and that sort of thing. So the Christian has a tremendous interest in science, which carries the knowledge authority today. Its pronouncements are taken to be knowledge of reality. relative to philosophical and theological claims, which are taken to be idle speculation by and large. So what I want to do is to maybe clear up some of this, and I'm going to go in the following way. I want to start by talking about something called scientism, and then I want to talk about science itself, and has science helped or hurt Christian truth claims? And we'll talk about that. I think maybe I'll give you a little perspective on that. And then I'm going to raise the question, well, what do you do when all the experts in a field agree against your view? I mean, that's kind of a tough place to be. So we'll talk about that. And then I'll say a word about evolutionary theory, what it is and what it is not, and then open it up for questions. So let's begin with scientism. I was invited years ago, when I lived in Baltimore, to a layperson's home. This layperson had a doctorate in psychology, and her husband was a professor of neuroscience at Johns Hopkins, both believers, but they ran with a pretty heady crowd. And they wanted to invite a bunch of their unbelieving friends to their home for little hors d'oeuvres and for me to give a case for Christianity. And so I more than agreed to do that. One of the fellows that was one of the Christians said, I'm going to be bringing my boss, who's been an engineer in our firm for like 30 years, and he has a PhD in physics from Johns Hopkins, and he doesn't like Christians. And so I said, just as long as there's a metal detector in the front door, that's fine. You can bring him. But so I was at the hors d'oeuvre table, and sure enough, out of the corner of my eye, I saw this friend of mine and this little older gentleman coming with him, which I rightly assumed was this physicist. So they come over and we're introduced, and we exchange pleasantries. And no sooner than we had said hello to one another, this guy says, say, I hear that you're a philosopher and a theologian. And I said, well, I give it my best shot. And he said, yeah, he said, I actually used to be interested in that stuff myself when I was a teenager. But when I became a mature thinker, I began to realize that if you can't quantify your data and measure it and test it in the laboratory empirically, it's nothing but a bunch of hot air and idle speculation. And that's what I think of philosophy and theology. Now, that's scientism, and there are two versions of scientism. One of them says that science is the only way to gain knowledge of reality. There is no other way except through the empirical methods of science. And weak scientism is the view that while other fields may provide some minimal reasonable beliefs, minimally justified beliefs about reality, the kind of justification and rational support that science can claim for its assertions is far higher than those of other fields. And so they'll grant some minor intellectual authority to other fields in the university, but they're still way overshadowed by the claims of the hard sciences. And so let me just give a brief response to this. I think about the only thing you need to say about strong scientism is that it's self-refuting. I really think that pretty much does the job. Now, what does it mean to say something is self-refuting? Well, it's like the sentence, no sentence of English is longer than 3 words. That statement is itself self-refuting. So if a sentence is an assertion is self-refuting, that means it falsifies itself. And since it makes itself false, it cannot possibly be true. So it's not like, well, scientism, strong scientism may be false now, but if we keep working on it in 20 years, we'll find out that it's true after all. No, they're never going to discover that strong scientism is true, because it's like the statement, I can't speak a word of English. I mean, it's just self-refuting. It makes itself false. This gentleman kept going on, and after about 2 minutes, I interrupted him, and I said, I'm struggling, sir. I don't know what to do, and I don't know, maybe you can help me. I said, do I understand you correctly to say that knowledge of reality can only come through the hard sciences when they formulate something and can test it empirically in a lab? He said, absolutely. This is what I've learned over years of work in science. And that everything else is just hot air and idle opinion. Yes, so I said, you've probably uttered 30 or 40 assertions in the last 2 or 3 minutes, and I can't think of a single one that could be tested in the laboratory. And I don't mean to be mean-spirited here, but if I'm right about that, and please point to one of your statements that could be. I'd love to be corrected on this, but if I'm wrong about that, it follows that all you've been giving us for 2 minutes is a bunch of hot air. And I got too much to do with my time to listen to a bunch of idle nonsense. And you got anything more than that? Well, he jumped to something about Einstein, of which he was wrong. And it was quite an evening for this poor gentleman. But it's self-refuting. Now, you want to look for things that are self-refuting. The expert on self-refuting is my friend Frank Beckwith. He has T-shirts, or he's going to get them. Ask me about my vow of silence. He's got one, I'll stop copying you if you'll stop copying me first. And he just told me his latest, my brother is an only child. So when you hear a self-refuting statement, you just have to point out that it destroys itself. Now, weak scientism is not self-refuting because it will allow for some authority in other fields. So it's not saying the hard sciences are the only way to know things, but it's saying that it is a vastly superior way of knowing things. Now, there are 3 problems with weak scientism. And the first one, and this is always bad for a view, it's just plain false. Because there are things that we know outside science that we know with greater authority than things that we know inside science. So, after my colon cancer surgery, my doggone stomach wouldn't come online. And so I was supposed to be in the hospital 5 days. I was in 9, bloated, more than I normally am. And so about the 7th day, this new nurse came in to take care of me. And we got to talking. She was a very pleasant gal. And she said, well, what do you do? And I said, well, I'm a professor of philosophy. I said I did start off with a degree in physical chemistry, and then I went to seminary and did a degree in theology, and then I have 2 degrees in philosophy. And she looked at me and she said, wow, that was really quite a jump, quite a change. And I said, let me tell you what I think you're thinking before you say so, and you just tell me if I'm right or wrong. Here's what I think you're thinking. Gosh, the guy started off in a branch of study where you can really know the truth. I mean, you can test things, you deal with hard facts, you deal with proven claims, and then he moved over into these other fields of study where I think they're fun, but you kind of just shuffle your thoughts and feelings, and you spin out your philosophy of life or whatever it is, and they're not really cognitively testable. And she said, my gosh, that's exactly what I was thinking. She realized, I'm not kidding. And so I felt it my obligation to straighten her out. And so I said, well, you'll be surprised to know that we have greater rational warrant for believing certain things in ethics than we do certain things in physics. Well, she said, give me an example. And I said, I have greater epistemic or rational confidence that the assertion torturing babies for the fun of it is wrong than I do that electrons exist. And here's why. If you've studied the history of the electron, you will know that as it went from the J.J. Thomson electron to views shortly after his, when the concept of the ether changed, and then you go to the Bohr electron, and then you go to the quantum electron, of which there is no such thing as the quantum electron. There are several different views of an electron today. You realize that there never was such a thing as a Thomsonian electron. It didn't exist. There never was probably any such thing as the Bohr electron that I was taught in elementary and junior high, where you have these orbitals that are these little like a solar system, and the electron sticks in this little orbital and moves continuously into another one, and so on. And I said, those have all been abandoned. Now, would it be within the realm of possibility that we could learn something in 50 years that would let us know that the current view of what an electron is was mistaken after all, and there are no such things as the 2016 electron? That's when I was in the hospital. But then the electron is radically different. In fact, it's so different that we probably shouldn't even use the same word for it, but we're going to call it an electron just because we're used to the word. Could that happen? In light of the history of the, well, yeah, it could. Well, can you think of any facts or any new discoveries of information or data that would demonstrate to us, oh my gosh, I've been wrong about the torturing babies thing? It turns out that it's actually not only morally permissible, but sometimes it's a moral obligation to torture babies purely for the fun of it. Now, I can imagine getting to a point where the culture, as led by Nancy Pelosi, could rapidly reach the point where people believed that. I'm not talking about that. I'm asking, can you imagine them getting to the point where it would be rational, in light of new evidence that was discovered, to believe we were wrong about that proposition? I can't. Therefore, at this present moment, I have more rational authority for believing that ethical assertion than I do that electrons exist. Well, literally her jaw just dropped. I mean, she turned a little, I don't think anybody ever said anything like that to her. But the point I'm trying to illustrate is there are things we know outside of science. Another example would be math and logic. Math and logic are not known through empirical tests. Math and logic is known by something called a priori intuition. That means it's known by direct intuition that isn't based on the senses. It's based on a grasp of the mind of the proper laws. And math and logic are assumed by science. Science doesn't prove them, all right? And I could go on and on about that. So there are a number of things that we know outside of science that we actually know with greater authority than many of the things we know in science. The second problem with weak scientism is something called anti-realism. Now, this is a $1.98 word, but basically what it means is that there are a lot of philosophers and scientists who don't believe the purpose of a scientific theory is to gain truth about the world. That would be a scientific realist view. The purpose of a scientific theory is not truth, it is predictive success or empirical accuracy. And so that means that what the scientist sees herself as doing is not trying to gain theories that have theoretical entities in it, like strings or whatever it might be, that really do represent what's already out there. No, no, no. The concept of a string simply serves the function of enabling us to make better predictions about things. And we've learned, the argument goes, from the history of science, that many, many times a theory can make accurate predictions and the theory turns out to be completely false. There was the theory of the ether, which you probably don't know about because it was judged to be false. But it made incredibly accurate predictions, such that John Clerk Maxwell said it is one of the best verified theories in the history of physics. And nobody believes it anymore. But it did make accurate predictions. So it could be that weak scientism, which is claiming that science gives us a true picture of reality, could be false, at least in some cases, because the purpose of science, at least in those cases, is not truth, but predictive success. And they'll keep tweaking with this theory until it predicts it's successful. That's all. Third, the third problem with weak scientism is that it cannot state or defend its own assumptions. Science makes a whole host of assumptions. And I won't go into all of them, but for example, science assumes there's such a thing as truth, and they assume a fairly specific version of what truth is. And there are a range of assumptions that science makes that science itself cannot justify those assumptions. Every single one of those assumptions are being criticized and rejected in the university today. So there's not a single assumption of science that has not been criticized and rejected by some scholars in the academy. Well, if science is going to continue to claim authority with integrity, then it needs to be able to state precisely what its assumptions are, which it can't do. Scientists aren't trained in stating those assumptions and in defending those assumptions. It turns out that both of those tasks are philosophical in nature, that stating and defending the assumptions of science are philosophical tasks. And so a field is no stronger than its assumptions. And in this case, philosophy shows itself to be more authoritative than science in defending the assumptions of science. And so for those three reasons, there are things outside of science that we know with less certainty than, with greater certainty than things in science. If a scientific theory is successful, we don't have to imply that that means it really truly grasps the world. It could be that the scientific theory is just predictively successful, but it's not true. And then finally, the assumptions of science are not themselves scientifically statable or defendable. And if those assumptions, which have all been called into question, are going to be clarified and defended, it's going to fall to the field of philosophy to state and defend what those assumptions are. So far what I've tried to say is that strong and weak scientism, I'm working on a book on this now for folk that are trying to raise children in this culture. Strong and weak scientism are false. One other thing that I'll mention along the lines of scientism is that actually philosophy, generally speaking, is more fundamental and authoritative than science is. Philosophy is more basic and authoritative than science is. And a scientist who doesn't know philosophy is going to set himself up or herself up for real embarrassment. I'll give you a couple of examples. One from Stephen Hawking, who wrote a book claiming that we don't need God anymore because the universe came into existence out of nothing. Okay, so there it is. The universe came into existence out of nothing, and we don't need God. And so I'm thinking, whoa, this is going to be a really cool discovery. I mean, I can't wait to read the defense of this. Well, I knew what was going to come, and sure enough, I got there. And what Hawking and his co-author mean by nothing is a quantum vacuum. Now, it doesn't matter what a quantum vacuum is for our purposes. What does matter is that a quantum vacuum is not nothing. It in his theory, exists. It's got properties. It's got quantitative features that are attributed to it and can be measured. So it's not, when philosophers use the term nothing, they mean the complete and utter absence of anything whatsoever. The absence of any properties or things or causal powers or, I mean, nothing is just absolute nothing. It's the absence of anything whatsoever. Now, you can't get something from nothing, because when we talk about getting something from something, like a cake from eggs and flour and so on, the from has to exist in order to get something from it. You can't get something from nothing. And Hawking's claim that you can is the claim that we could get a universe from a quantum vacuum. But that's not the claim. If he had just a little philosophical training, he wouldn't have embarrassed himself. But his statement is an embarrassment in the philosophical community because it's kind of a sophomoric mistake. I think Planting has said that a Christian philosopher well known that if one of Hawking's books was an undergrad paper, he'd probably get about a C- on it. And he's a great physicist, but he's pretty bad at philosophy, and he needs to just stick to the physics and not kind of move off the territory there. And then our friend Richard, I never met a theological argument I hated, didn't like, Richard Dawkins. And Richard Dawkins raises a question on O'Reilly. O'Reilly, I keep doing this. It's my cancer. All right, you're lucky I'm coherent. Some of you are thinking I'm not, but same to you, ladies and gentlemen. He's on O'Reilly, and O'Reilly says, okay, where'd the world come from? And Dawkins looks at him smugly and says, we're working on it. Okay. Now, what he didn't realize is that the objection that says that the world had a beginning and it had to have been created by something supernatural outside the world is not a claim that's based upon our limited knowledge right now in physics, so that maybe in 75 years we'll discover finally how this happened without appealing to God. That was his view. No. The argument is an in-principle argument based on the limits of science. Science cannot explain the origin of the very thing it needs before it can start explaining anything. Let me say that again. Science cannot explain the origin of the universe, which is the very thing it needs before it can start explaining anything. When scientific explanations are applied, they use one part of the universe, plug it into a law of nature to explain another part of the universe. But you can't explain how the universe and its laws came into existence by doing that. So science, in principle, will never be able to explain the origin of the universe because it can only start, it's got to stand in line. It can only start its work once we've got the universe there. So it was just an embarrassment, and I threw a brick through the television, and reminded me of my old basketball days where I threw a lot of bricks. But so much for science being the authoritative discipline. Thank God for science, but it's not what scientism affirms. So, strong scientism, self-refuting. Weak scientism, it's false. There are things that we know with greater certainty than some scientific claims. Successful scientific theories could be interpreted in an anti-realist way. Rather than saying they're true, we could say they're just predictively accurate. And the assumptions of science cannot be justified by science. Are there examples where the field of philosophy is more basic and important than science? Yeah. In the case of the universe coming into existence from nothing, it's the philosophical notion of nothing, not the Hawking's notion of nothing, which says it came from a quantum vacuum. By the way, and then finally, the Dawkins case would be an example. Regarding the Hawking's thing, there's a joke that it's not really funny, but it makes a point. And their group of scientists come up to God one day and said, "We don't need you anymore." God looks surprised and says, "Well, pray tell, well, how is that?" And he said, and the scientist said, "We can create life. We've finally done it, so we don't need you anymore." And God said, I'd like to see this. And so the scientists, they bend down on their knees and they scoop up some dust, and they're getting ready to, and God says, "Could you wait just 1 second? Would you mind getting your own dust?" I'd kind of like to say to Brother Hawkins, would you get your own quantum vacuum? You know what I mean. All right, now what about science itself? So much for scientism. What about science itself? Well, I'd like to make 4 general points and move on then to the next topic. First of all, there is no such thing as science. There just is no such thing. And there are myriads of sciences, but there's not just one branch of the world called science that speaks univocally about reality. You have a whole host of different kinds of sciences that study different things. Archaeology is a science, one dirty dig after another. There's cosmology, organic chemistry is different than physical chemistry. And so you have a whole host of different sciences, and they're not speaking with one voice. They have different views of the world based on the different things they study. The other thing is that science doesn't say anything. It is scientists who say things. Okay? Remember, when people say science says, that's just that's an oxymoron. Science doesn't say anything. Scientists do. And the frustrating part is that not all the time, but many times when scientists say things, they're actually speaking as philosophers and not as scientists. Not all the time, but that happens. You have to be very careful when you hear a scientist make a claim on the evening news, which turns out, by the way, to be a rumor mill for pop science. You just want to be real careful. And don't just buy everything that you hear. Now, number two, I would say that 95% of science is completely irrelevant to Christianity. Has nothing to do with Christianity. I could care less if a methane molecule has 4 hydrogens around it or 50. Making a difference to me if water's H5O. I don't care. So an awful lot of the discoveries of science have nothing to do with the assertions of Christian theology. They're just different. My view about, let's say spiritual gifts, is not going to impact a chemist doing his or her work. So these things are just different fields. And 95% of the time is my estimate. They're doing different things, and there's no competition or clash or anything. They're just different. So that's my take on a good bit of science. Now, with the remaining 5%, I'd say about 3% of it is positive toward Christianity, and about 2% is negative. Now, I'll explain what I mean by that. But I'm just going to list these. You don't need to write them down. But what do I mean by positives? Well, the discovery of the Big Bang was helpful. It showed the universe had a beginning, and it reconfirmed what theologians had been saying and philosophers for a long time. The second law of thermodynamics, which says the universe is running out of gas and it needed to be wound up. And so this indicates that there was a beginning to the universe where all the useful energy was put in at the beginning, and since then it's been used up. That was a good discovery. By the way, the early people who discovered that law, like Lord Kelvin, knew immediately that this implied a winder-upper. If things are winding down, there needs to be a winder-upper. And that's another one. The fine-tuning of the universe, which you may have heard of or not. I'm not going to go into detail except to say that we've discovered that a lot of the features of nature, like the mass of a proton, rest mass of a proton, or the charge of an electron, or the rate of expansion of the Big Bang, if some 30 of these were different on the order of a billionth of a billionth of a billionth of a percentage point, stronger or weaker, there could be no life anywhere in the universe. This is one of the things that caused the famous atheist Anthony Flew, who was an atheist for almost half a century, to convert to belief in God, because he could not explain this. And he said, if we'd had this kind of evidence, like fine-tuning, when I was a young man, I would have never become an atheist. This is powerful stuff. Now, I'm going quickly. My purpose is not to defend these arguments and give counter-replies and replies, but I'm listing here. The discovery that things are made of information. Information is all throughout a living thing, and information, as many scientists assume, can only come from a mind. And so this provides some evidence to think that there is a mind behind the information in living things, and information is not physical. There was a conference just recently on what is information, and there was one person who argued it was physical, and everybody else argued that information is not a physical thing. And it's very much like the soul in various ways. But it's caused problems. The origin of consciousness and the soul cannot be explained by evolutionary theory. Never will. It's the wrong kind of explanation. And there's a strong case that can be made that consciousness is real. Some of you are providing counterexamples to that. But nevertheless, there is a strong reason to believe that consciousness and the soul are real. And I've written a book called The Soul, Why It's Real and Why It Matters, How We Know It's Real and Why It Matters. Won't talk about that. But on the assumption that there is such a thing as consciousness in the soul, evolution and the science cannot explain where it came from. Cannot explain. I've written a whole book on this. and looked at the best attempts, and there will never be an explanation for the origin of consciousness, because scientific explanation is the wrong kind of explanation to explain this kind of thing. So it's a difference in methodology. It isn't a limitation of where we're at right now. Hey, how about positive psychology? You heard of positive psychology? It's a movement that says instead of focusing on people's problems, let's start focusing on what's positive about them and life. And you know one of the things they've discovered? That one of the keys to a healthy psyche or mind that will help you get rid of anxiety and depression is the regular assertion all throughout the day of gratitude. In fact, they've discovered that expressing gratitude is even more important than having hope. It's so important to express gratitude. But of course, the atheist has got a problem here because there's no one to whom to express it. Unless you're grateful for a spouse fixing a good meal or something. But when I look at a sunset over Maui, my heart wells up with gratitude. Now, what an atheist can do is be happy about it. He can say, I really like that. I'm happy about it. But that's not what changes your life. What changes your life is the recognition that what this is a gift to me, and I want to express to the giver that I'm grateful for what they've given. It's almost as though we were designed somehow to function best when we do things the New Testament says. I don't want to get too radical here, but let me just suggest that as a passing thought. All right, I would say that archaeology has provided a tremendous amount of confirmation of the New Testament. And then finally, there's this thing called teleology, which is things happening for a purpose. That's a very theistic kind of notion. And it's coming back in to biology and to psychology, that they're returning to the belief that things happen for the sake of a purpose or an end. It's very interesting, and that's a theistic friendly move. So there's a ton of things science has discovered that have been very favorable towards our worldview, very favorable. So don't let anybody tell you that that's not the case. Now, there are problems, but let me be very clear that the problems that science presents really don't have much to do with God's existence or whether Christianity is true. Instead, they attack the doctrine of biblical inerrancy. In other words, they try to show that certain texts of Scripture cannot be true, but they don't have the implication that God does not exist or that Jesus didn't perform miracles and raise from the dead. And an example would be evolutionary problems with the early chapters of Genesis. I'll say a little bit more about evolution in a second. Certain archaeological discoveries have been contrary to what the Bible says, and so they present problems that need to be solved somehow. So archaeology is not just, I think it's mostly helpful, but there are some areas that raise problems that need to be solved. And so archaeology would be the second example. And then the third example would be neuroscience, which allegedly seems to prove there's no such thing as consciousness or the soul. Now, neuroscience can do no such thing. And the only thing a neuroscientist can do is show dependency relations between the mind and the brain. It might be able to show, for example, that if you get Alzheimer's in the brain, your memories won't be accessible to you. Through what's called neuroplasticity, it can also show that if you change your habits of your thought content, you will regroove your brain and rid yourself of depression and anxiety through thinking differently in an habituated kind of way. And so what psychology can do is to show that the brain affects the mind and the mind affects the brain, but it can't show anything else. It can't demonstrate they're the same thing. It can't say, therefore, consciousness is in the brain. No, consciousness is in the soul. They just do things to each other. Okay? Thomas Aquinas knew that in the middle of the 1200s. He said, look, if you get damaged in your brain, you won't be able to think very well. Well, spread it not abroad in Gath, nor share it in Zion. But if you have your eyes poked out, you won't be able to have visual sensations. Is that news to you? Now, all that neuroscience has done from Aquinas' day, because they knew if you got poked in the eye, you couldn't see, is to now identify the exact place in the brain that ends up being the important place that needs to be damaged. That's all. But that's just a detail. That's not a different point. It's making, I mean, we dualists would expect there to be places, even hylomorphic dualists, of which I'm one, Frank. So, all right. Now, I want to address one more issue here, and then say a word about what evolution is, and then we'll have Q&A. The claim has been made by theistic evolutionists. By the way, I'm editing a book that will be out November 30th that, in my opinion, is the best book ever written. I say that with great humility. I'm editing it with 3 other guys, Steve Meyer, Wayne Grudem, and a scientist from the UK. It's 800 pages. It's got 25 authors. 12 of them are full professors at major secular universities in Europe. 4 chapters are devoted to the Adam and Eve question and demonstrate that this nonsense about Adam and Eve being born 140,000 years apart from one another is based upon bad methodology. And this book is going to be a bombshell. It's going to be called a scientific, theological, and philosophical critique of evolution. But the argument that comes back is, but look, all of the experts agree that evolution is true. I mean, if you go to any major university and you survey the paleontology or biology department, you'll be lucky if you find somebody in there who's willing to at least say that they don't accept the theory, the general theory of evolution. And so, in any other area of life, the argument goes, if you had all the oncologists agreeing about a certain treatment, would you take the treatment or not? Well, I'd sure as heck take it. And the same would be true of any branch of science or any field for that matter. If 99.99% of the professoriate in that branch of knowledge is in agreement about something, then what gall is it to go against their agreement? And I think that that is, generally speaking, true. And I think we all practice that. I think we would tend to go in a field with what the experts are in agreement on. So now how would we deal with a very strong argument like that? Well, in this case, I think it turns out to be fairly simple. And my own view is, I think that you are rationally justified in rejecting the majority expert opinion on something if 2 things are present. If there are 2 things present. And the first one is, you can give a sociological or even theological explanation for the agreement or the homogeneity. You can explain it as a result of sociology or perhaps even theology, and not because the facts demand that unity. Now, when it comes to science of evolution, one of the most authoritative books written on this subject was written by Neil Gillespie, a historian of science at Georgia State, I think. Published a book a good while ago, probably 20-some years ago, with the University of Chicago Press. And the book was Charles Darwin and the Problem of Creation. And he argued, and this guy is a historian of that period, he said that evolution won not because the evidence was on its side. Quite the opposite. He said in the early decades, the evidence was on the side of the creationists. Because Darwin predicted, for example, there would be hundreds of thousands of fossils found in the fossil record, and they were absent. There were a few possible transition forms that were criticized by scientists, but there weren't all these fossils. And there were a number of other factors that made Darwin's theory pretty implausible. Well, why did it win? He said, here's the answer. It ridded biology of theology. They were able to get theology out of biology so that now biology became a natural science rather than having the biologist have to walk over to the divinity school and say, hey, can I teach this? And that bugged them because physics and chemistry had been naturalized with God not having a role in that. And so there has been a desire to keep theological types of explanations completely out of science. And so science has adopted a view that says you can only allow natural explanations when you're doing science. So to say that the information in a living thing clearly came from an intelligent mind is to stop doing science and start doing religion, because science is limited to naturalistic explanations. Do you follow me? So one of the reasons that there's homogeneity is because that's the way that biology has been defined. And it's a sociological fact, folks. It's not a scientific fact or evidence from the fossil record. It's a sociological fact that scientists have wanted to get theologians out of their business. And so evolution is the only other game in town. They've got to make it work. Other than that, things just pop into existence fully formed out of nothing. So as you go home, you might see a sheep, half a sheep pop into existence, or, war paint, the horse that rides triumphantly through Arrowhead Stadium when we've kicked the donkey's tails. And I think part of it has to do with theology. I can't tell you how many perverts there are in the scientific community. I just found out about another one, John Searle, who's at UC Berkeley, has defended kind of a materialist view of the person over the years. And I have criticized his views in print, and here to find out that he's a pervert. He's been hitting on undergraduate student women for decades and asking them to sleep with him. He watches pornography in his office regularly at school. Finally, one of the women went to a high administrator, and basically the answer that she got, this is online, was, we've known about this for years, but he's a star. And he is. He's a star. And if we lose Searle, our department is going to lose its ranking. So we need him here. Well, I think a lot of this has to do with sex, because if God doesn't exist and we're just evolved, you can have sex any way you want it, and you have to feel bad about it. I actually had an SC professor say that in class. I have it on tape. You're entitled to go with the minority if you can explain why the majority holds the view they do without it being due to the evidence, but rather it being due to certain sociological facts as to how new grad students are enculturated into the biological community. Am I making sense, or am I making sense? All right. The other thing that has to be present is that there needs to be a small group of highly sophisticated, extremely well-educated dissenters that are on your side. There have to be a majority. Thomas Kuhn, I don't agree with everything he said, but he said long ago, and it still holds, that sometimes major theories that everybody believes in are overturned by just a small little splinter group that says, no, this doesn't make any sense, and they dig their heels in, and eventually they eat away at the major view. Now, I think if we didn't have anybody that had any credentials and that were experts in various fields of the relevant sciences defending an intelligent design view, that wouldn't be a good thing. Would you be willing to agree with me? But sometimes you want to look at the CVs of the people on, Bill Dembski has a doctorate of mathematics from the University of Chicago, a PhD in philosophy from the University of Illinois, and a THM in theology from Princeton Seminary, where he started an evangelical underground club called the Charles Hodge Society, just to agitate the liberals at Princeton. Steve Meyer is kind of an idiot. He got a doctorate at the University of Cambridge. But the point is that we have these two things in place. We have a very sophisticated group of ID people that are making very sophisticated arguments. And so I think with these two factors, we're entitled to see how far we can push the paradigm. Let's give it a shot. Let's see if we can push it. And I should say that, and this is for Frank, but I think that we don't need to make these issues simply scientific. There is a design argument for God's existence that is far more fundamental than science that is a purely philosophical argument that we could hold on to. Now, a last word. What is evolution? It has three meanings. And it's the third one that's the problem. The first meaning is things can change over time within limits. Things can change over time within limits. So if rabbits move to an area of the country where there's a lot of snow, eventually their fur will turn white. But they won't become, leprechauns or something else. All right, so everybody agrees with it. The second one is the thesis of common descent. That's basically the idea that there was an original simple form of life that appeared naturalistically, and that there's an evolutionary tree from that original form of life where things branch off, but we're all connected together through a common ancestor. Now, there are a number of problems with that view, and my view is I think that one's 50-50. It's got things to say for it, but it's got problems. The main issue is the third one, and it's called the blind watchmaker thesis. And it's the idea that all the processes that brought about life and its diversity were entirely naturalistic processes, purely naturalistic processes, without any need for divine intervention whatsoever. Now that is what I would challenge. I would want to argue that the laws of nature and chance mutations are not adequate to produce what we see, but there needed to be a supreme being doing something that was detectable. Now, theistic evolutionists are a bizarre lot because they say, well, God guided the process as long as you're not allowed to know he did it. And I'm not making that up. God's direction cannot be detectable. Because if you could actually detect that God did something, that would be intelligent design. So they will allow God to guide the process where evolution is an unguided process, so it becomes now a guided, unguided process. My head starts exploding. But it also is a revisionist view of the Old Testament, in my opinion, that allows God work to do as long as he doesn't do any work that anybody is able to see and discover. All right, I've said enough. I've made some enemies. I've made a few friends. And we have time for some questions or comments. And I think there's a microphone. Yes, sir.
Hi, I have a question about intelligent design.
Yes.
Is there anything in intelligent design that necessarily counts against theistic evolution?
Yeah. Intelligent design and theistic evolution are completely incompatible with one another. Now, Michael Behe is a person who wrote Darwin's Black Box, and he is an ID proponent. He doesn't believe that God intervened anywhere along the way. So he would be in agreement with theistic evolutionists about that. But what he does believe is that there are certain places along the development of life that can only be best explained by God creating in some way that structure, so that the history of the development of life has a number of places that provide evidence of a theistic explanation. And so that becomes a legitimate part of the scientific work. Whereas theistic evolutionists would say, that's theology, there can be no evidence that God did anything. God had to act incognito, because once you start claiming that this particular feature of the process is best explained by a designer God, then that's tantamount to abandoning evolution, which says that it's purely naturalistic in its methodology. So God can act as long as it's undetectable.
Just a quick follow-up.
Yeah.
Biologos, which is a
Yes.
theistic evolution group, they argue that fine-tuning is a good argument for a creator. So they are a theistic evolutionist group that says that some design is detectable. So I'm wondering how that squares with what you were saying.
Well, I've talked to Carl Giberson, one of the leaders of Biologos, and I told him that you're basically cognitively inconsistent. The first person who used this view, by the way, was Howard Van Til at Wheaton College, who argued that the Big Bang and the fine-tuning of the universe were evidence for God. But I said, why don't you wait for a naturalistic explanation of those? Well, I mean, you're jumping, it's called the taxi cab fallacy. You ride the cab until you get to your donation, your location, and if you don't like where it goes from there, you jump out. Well, they ride the naturalistic explanation up until the fine-tuning thing, and they jump out and appeal to a divine explanation. What we're saying is, if you're going to do that in one place, you ought to do it in every place where it's warranted. You shouldn't set up the rules so that we can't do it in other places. God, they're saying that this is inappropriate because it violates the rules of biology to do this in biology. And we're saying, well, the cosmologists would probably say the same thing. So, I mean, why do you allow yourself to go against cosmology, which is naturalized and doesn't appeal to a designer to explain fine-tuning, and all of a sudden you won't let people do it if they think there's the issue should be the evidence, not whether it violates rules that you think are violated. So I think you're inconsistent. You'll allow for ID here, but you won't let people follow the trail there. And my view is, let's push the case and see what happens. And if there's grounds for an ID inference, so be it. If it turns out there's not, I'm not going to lose any sleep over it. I'll probably be dead by then anyway. So,
Thank you.
yes, thank you for a good question. We have time for one more. Two more. This gentleman, and then
It's a lot
this.
of pressure for one more.
Yeah.
One more question. I'm personally a big fan of the philosophic type truths that are very foundational, like the self-refuting when somebody says to you, I will only believe anything that's provable with science. The immediate bombshell type challenge to that of saying, the self-refuting statement that makes them really rethink that idea. And in that spirit, my question would be, I've personally found when you push someone to the final ends of their belief, they say, well, I am just a molecules in motion, materialistic, deterministic person. There is no such thing as the mind. And it might be slightly off topic, but I was wondering if there would be a back of the napkin type philosophic notion that you could say to challenge the idea that...
C.S. Lewis stated it in his book Miracles, and it's been stated recently in Richard Swinburne's new book, Mind, Brain, and Free Will. And the argument basically goes like this. If you're just a brain and a central nervous system that is a collection of molecules, and those molecules are what are causing your jaws to move and the sounds to come out of your mouth, then you're like a parrot, which you don't intentionally choose to make the assertions because you think they're true. You're just programmed to make noises by your brain structure. But if that's the case, why should I ever believe a single thing you say? Because your sounds aren't the result of rational deliberation, because a process of rational deliberation about what kind of house you're going to buy there are stages in that process. Those stages do not follow a causal structure. It's not like one stage causes the next one and that causes the next one. That's what happens in the brain. One brain state causes the next brain state, causes the next brain state. Rational processes have one state that infers or provides evidence for the next step, that the thinker must see the connection. And so the connections are not causal, they're logical and evidential. And so if all you've got's the brain, then the noises that are coming out are simply produced by this physical causal chain, and there would be no reason to trust anything you said. This is why neuroscience can't hold that you're just your brain, because they have to ask, when they've got the monitor on, they don't have that, they have access to the brain but not the person's mind. So they have to say to them, what's going on in you right now? And they have to trust that when the person reports what's going on, so they can come up with a correlation between a brain state and a mental state, and they have no access to the mental state, except for first-person reports, they have to assume that the patient believes that what he's about to say is the truth, he intends to tell the truth, and he believes that these words will express that belief. But those are mental states. So neuroscience depends on the mental in order for its experiments to be trusted as just the guttural utterances of a non-rational set of molecules that are bumping into one another. What a country.